conversation between
Okay.
the two of us. Would you please introduce yourself?
Okay, Linda D. Coleman Friedman. Okay, and I was born and raised here in Savannah. My mother's family, my mother's mother came from Israel. They called it Palestine in those days. And ended up in Vidalia, and then when she was 6 years old, they moved here. And my maternal grandfather had a grocery store somewhere downtown around 37th Street on the west side. I don't remember exactly where she said it was, but somewhere down there. The grocery store until he died, I guess. And then my father's family came, most of his family came from Eastern Europe, Germany, Prussia, and my great-great-grandmother came over in 1849, and with 3 children, and then had several more after she got here. And his mother's family, that was his father's family, his mother's family came from essentially from Richmond, Virginia. And I've done a lot of genealogical research, and found out that I have 5 Confederate ancestors. I had to put a plug in. Anyway, 2 great-grandfathers and 3 great-great-uncles fought in the war between the states. And I've done a lot of research on that. And one thing I am curious to find out is how far back my family actually is affiliated with Mikveh Israel. My father's went to Mikveh Israel, and his mother went to Mikveh Israel. How much further back they're technically on the rolls, I don't know, but I would really be interested in finding out.
I think you could probably do that by going to, there are record books.
Yeah, I know.
Dating back all the way from the beginning of the congregation.
Are they at the archives at the
They are at the Savannah Jewish Archives.
Yeah,
yes.
okay.
So
That's,
for the notebooks.
I had gotten that far as to get that much information that that's where I should look, but I never got a chance to go before. And
actually, I believe that separate from what Kay Cole does, I think Mikveh Israel actually rents space for their memorabilia. So you might even be able to access it through our museum committee.
Oh.
So I'm not
Okay.
sure about that.
Yeah.
But,
Excuse me 1 second. Morris, would you bring me a tissue, please?
What?
Sorry.
tell me a little something about the what you know about your grandparents and your uncles in the Confederacy. You said you did. I don't normally ask those questions, but I think to some people they might not think that there would be Jews who either owned slaves and certainly
That's a misconception or misperception, whichever. There were actually 10,000 Jews that fought in the Confederacy, fought in the war between the states on both sides, and we were the largest single minority that fought in the war between the states. And most people don't realize that. They don't think of us as being in that venue. But I knew that my father was a member of the Sons of Confederate Veterans, and my grandmother had told stories about us having Confederate ancestors, which when I was little went right over my head. But as I got older, it rang some bells. And so I started, just for the fun of it, doing some research, and I slowly got into all of this. And one great-grandfather, my father's grandfather, at the time lived in Wilkinson County, Georgia, which is right about in the middle of the state. And he enlisted there and ended up fighting in, and this is a funny coincidence, he ended up fighting in a battle in Richmond. And my grandmother's father and his 2 brothers also fought for the Confederacy, and her father, my other great-grandfather, fought in the same battle. So they were 2 different units, but they fought in the same battle, never met each other, never at that point, and never had any idea that they would meet later and their children would fall in love and get married and become my grandparents.
Well, pardon me for even asking about this, because this really isn't the focus of the interview, but I'm kind of fascinated. Do you know if were they landowners? Did they own plantations?
I don't really know
how did they come to be?
I don't really know what they did. I have not gotten any information with that. Which one was it? Now I know that with my the three brothers that were in Richmond, not my grandfather, but one of his brothers, his older brother, was ended up being very prominent in Virginia politics after the war. Found that out. And one of them, I did do some research at the Savannah Public Library and found out that another great uncle of mine on my father's side, great uncle, who fought in a unit in Florida, that purportedly, according to the slave census, he did own 3 slaves. But I'm doubtful about the accuracy of that, because he owned a store on Broughton Street. And he was a bachelor, and I don't see where he would have had any need, either at home or in a store, for slaves. It wouldn't have made much sense. So I'm not sure the accuracy of that one. That's the only indication I found that any of them ever owned slaves.
You know, when I talk to people who tell an immigrant story, people
Mhm.
coming to the United States usually in the 1880s, and they end up in Savannah, they had a mercantile store or a grocer.
Mhm.
And the Schmata store, sometimes they took it on the road and became the Jew store in a small town.
That was
But
his family.
so the ones that are here and seem to have these small stores that actually were embedded, if you will, modern term, into often black communities. Because when I asked who the clientele was, they were very friendly with the communities, but they were over on, you know, what was West Broad Street or in that area or on Broughton Street.
Well, the grocery store that my mother's father had, at that time, you know, today when you think 37th Street and you think the West Side, that's pure black community. Back then, that was a very affluent white community back in those days. And in fact, they lived in a house on 37th Street. It was a 2-story house, and I don't know who was upstairs and who was downstairs, but my mother's family was in one part, and then Ruth Stein's family was in the downstairs part, and they knew each other from childhood.
Wow.
And so, you know, that's the kind of families that lived in that area at that time. That was long before the demographics changed. And my great uncle that had the store on Broughton Street, he was something of a Renaissance man. He had, essentially it was a bookstore, but he sold a little bit of everything. And he was fascinated with learning and with research, and it didn't matter what it was, he got into it. I found I have a lot of stuff that was his, and I found where he actually sent samples of things to the Smithsonian Institute, which they have. I guess they still have somewhere. But anyway, of unusual specimens and species and what have you. So he had these off-the-wall interests all over the place.
And those are really cool stories. And the other thing you just mentioned about a grandmother coming from Palestine,
Yes.
that's an unusual. How did she end up in the United States?
Okay, that's a funny story in itself, a family story that has been unearthed, and I cannot actually technically vouch for the authenticity of it, but about half the family says it's true and half the family doesn't, so take your pick. But her father, my grandfather's family, actually was born in Russia, came to the United States. My grandfather was born here, and apparently sometime while he was a child, his father moved the family to Palestine. Why, I have no idea, but they did. And so when he grew up, that's when he met my grandmother over there. They got married, they had one child, and she was pregnant with the second child when this bizarre incident took place. As its story has been told to me, they had a farm, and they had one horse, which was crucial to the running of the farm. He had a horse. There was an Arab that had a mule, I believe it was, and the Arab challenged my grandfather to a race, mule against horse. Well, the horse won. Oh, it's a winner-take-all bet. My grandfather's horse won, so my grandfather legitimately would have taken the mule. Well, the Arab was a sore loser and shot my grandfather's horse. And because it was so crucial to the running of the farm, my grandfather got mad, turned around and shot the Arab. And then it was like, get out of Dodge. So his family had to flee, but they couldn't take my grandmother and the baby because she was pregnant with another baby. She couldn't travel, because in those days it was ship travel only, overland and ship travel only. She couldn't travel being pregnant. So he went, and they hooked up with some relatives they had up north who had some relatives down here somewhere or another in Vidalia. And they ended up moving to Vidalia, and then as soon as he was able to, he sent for her after the baby was born. And she and the 2 children came here, and then after they came here, she had 3 more children, the first of which was my mother. They were all born in Vidalia. So, like I said, I can't guarantee you that that story is true, but it makes a
Well, I
wonderful
got to
story.
tell you, it has no bearing on what we're doing because we're talking about growing up Jewish in Savannah.
Yeah.
But it's just a fascinating
I
sideline
thought it was a
story.
marvelous story.
And how wonderful that you can trace back your lineage or at least find it.
Yeah.
And so I'm going to mention 2 things. One is that the majority of Jews I talk to can't trace their lineage back past some pogrom or some terrible episode in history. Do you get a sense of responsibility to those who came before or to the future generations as being a keeper of these stories when you
in
can
fact,
actually
my
trace
nickname
them?
with everybody in the family is I'm the family historian and the family record keeper. Because if anybody asks a question or wants to know something, go talk to Linda. She knows. But I feel like, I've been interested in it ever since I was a child and sat at my grandmother's knee and used to listen to these stories. And I wish, and that was long before the days of tape recorders and all that stuff. And I would have given my eye teeth if I'd had a tape recorder that could have been going while she was talking. So I'm relying on memory, which these days is not terrific. So I wrote down as much as I could write down. And I tried to research what I could research. And I inherited a bunch of stuff. I was fortunate to inherit a great deal of stuff from my aunt, my father's sister. Family albums and photographs and a whole host of stuff. With my mother's family, it was bits and pieces that I literally made notes of on little snippets of paper. When she would tell me something, I'd grab a piece of paper and write it down before either one of us forgot it. Because she would all of a sudden remember something or, laugh and think of a funny story. And so I would write it down real quick. And years later, I took all these bits and pieces and got a tablet out and, wrote it all out. But then I really got into genealogical research with a cousin of mine, distant cousin of mine on my father's side. Just in terms of relationship, she and I are very close, like sisters. And I have thoroughly enjoyed the genealogical research. And Jeremy, my son, also has an interest in it, and he has really helped me, especially with the advent of the age of going online and doing research. He's terrific with that, with Ancestry and Jewish Gen and whatever else. And so we found a lot of stuff. And quite by accident, I located the synagogue in Richmond where my grandmother's family worshiped, contacted them. They have a museum and archives, and they had a tremendous amount of information on her family. And long story short, we took a trip to Richmond several years ago. I think it was in '09. Long story short, I actually found the graves of my great-great-grandparents there. Quite by accident. I was looking for one of these great uncles, great-great-uncles, and stumbled on my great-great-grandparents. And I'm like, oh, wow,
Well, let me go ahead and I need to ask you a couple of questions.
Yeah.
But I'm really fascinated by this because I reserve the right to go back and ask you about why this is important.
Oh, sure.
Because the whole purpose of this is to connect a new generation of people who are not used to doing the research and reading and
And you
going
asked me about
back.
responsibility to the future, especially since I've had, the granddaughter is now 7.5, and then the new one. I've always felt like, Jeremy's interested. Don't know whether he's going to have kids someday or not. Paul hasn't been terribly interested, but he said, Mom, I'm not interested now, but someday when I have a family, I probably will be. Well, I figured, okay, even if he's not, my granddaughters might be, or down the road, somebody might start getting into genealogical research. I'd like it to be there. Well, I've got originals of a lot of all of this stuff. That's tremendous stuff, like a letter that my great-grandfather wrote my great-great-grandfather asking for my great-grandmother's hand in marriage, and just their ketubah, and, all kinds of stuff. So what I'm in the process of doing, and I got waylaid by the events of this year, but what I've been in the process of doing is making copies of everything, and then I want to lodge the originals with the Jewish archives so they're protected. And I will give copies to both my boys so they can pass them down to whatever descendants there are, and the connection is there.
How fantastic. So I'm gonna ask you a totally different question.
Oh, okay.
So in Judaism, we pass our legacy by passing our rituals in terms of tradition.
Right.
How has finding this kind of information about the people who came before you, how does that connect to you Jewishly? Or does it?
Oh, it does. It does. For one thing, like I said, when we went to Richmond, I actually went to the synagogue that my grandmother worshipped in, and to me, it was a very powerful experience sitting where, at some point, she and her family sat and worshipped. Way back when. That was an emotional experience. And the other thing is, I vividly remember when my mother's mother was Orthodox, very Orthodox, and I vividly remember on Friday nights lighting the Shabbos candles with her and learning the traditions from her. And even though I grew up Reform, I always wanted more tradition in my life. And at that time, Mikveh Israel was far less traditional than it is now, way back when. Things are very cyclical with Mikveh Israel. Anyway, and so I gravitated more to the tradition, and when we got married, we decided we wanted more tradition in our lives, and that's why we joined the conservative synagogue and raised our children in the conservative synagogue. So it reinforced the traditional aspect of it, if you will, with what came before has caused the both of us, for that matter, because to a certain extent it's also happened to him, to want to pass on those traditions to our children.
So tell me about growing up at Mikveh Israel, and what kind of educational background, what did it prepare you for?
Well, I grew up, for the most part, with Rabbi Sterles. Okay, he was there when I was born, until he retired in 80, whatever it was, something. But anyway, I mean, age 80 for him, not 1980, age 80 something for him. Anyway, I vividly remember when we were in Sunday school, we were there for 2 hours, and like for an hour and a half or so, it was the classroom setting upstairs. For the last half hour or so, we would come downstairs in the sanctuary, and before we had our little children's service, he would call different children up and teach us the blessings, the blessing of the Shabbos candles, the 3 Hanukkah blessings, the Shabbat Kiddush. And in those days, all we were taught was phonetically, because we weren't taught Hebrew like you do in Hebrew school. And I was always the one that got the 3 Hanukkah blessings. I remember Connie first got the Kiddush, and I forgot who got the candles. But it was always the same one, and that's how we learned it. It was over and over. And it was so much fun. We thoroughly enjoyed it. And that's part of what started me wanting more tradition. And also, in fact, the book sitting right there, that bottom one on the stack, is one of our confirmation books about Jewish traditions. And that's actually more from I don't know about Orthodox, but at least conservative point of view with the traditions. And I kept thinking, the traditions in there aren't stuff that we do here. I always got puzzled by why don't we do it. As a child, it was difficult to understand. As I grew up, I got the connection and I figured it out. And it pleased me greatly when Mikveh Israel started to gravitate more toward the traditional. And in fact, in recent years, I have started going to services there again more often, because not only are my roots there, but with the tradition, more of the tradition being there, I'm a lot more comfortable than I used to be. So it has been an evolution over the years. And I also remember as a child, we rarely, if ever, had anything to do with the people at the JEA, because that was primarily the Orthodox and the conservative. And once in a long blue moon, it would be something that would be community-wise, but the others tended to look down their noses at us, tradition-wise. I remember that even in public school, when Jewish kids were in public school, they took 2 days off for a holiday. I took one. Like, how come you're not taking the second day off? Because we don't do that. Why not? I don't know. That was something we were never told. It's just that we had 1 day, they had 2, And I always thought, why can't I get the second day? And it wasn't a standpoint of getting out of school. It was the traditional part of it. And, things like that. So I'm pleased to see the evolution of returning to more tradition. I think that's a good thing, because I almost felt like the loss of tradition was like throwing the baby out with the bathwater, kind of a thing. And that's not always
If
good.
you could do a rewind, your children went through a more conservative upbringing. Yeah. So if you could do a rewind, do you think it's important to explain to children the reasons why they do certain rituals or do certain
Absolutely,
things?
because all through the years we talked about these things. And when they went to day school, they went to Rambam, and when they went to day school, there were times when they said, okay, we do thus and such, without the explanation behind why we do thus and such. They'd come home and they'd say, okay, we're supposed to do thus and such. They'll say, okay, we'll do it. Now, does anybody know why we do it? I don't know. Well, sometimes I do, and sometimes I didn't know. But I think you need as much of the why behind it as you do the actual whatever it is you're doing. because it helps to reinforce it. It helps to ingrain it in you as instead of just something by rote for the heck of it.
In all fairness,
All right, hold on. Would you please introduce yourself?
Oh.
I'm Morris Friedman, Linda's husband. What I was interjecting was the fact that, to be fair about Rambam, they did explain a lot of things.
They did.
They did do the why, because the Orthodox are very strict about that. They do want you to know what, but they also want you to know why.
But occasionally, either something would get skipped over, glossed over, what have you, I don't know. It wasn't very often, but every once in a while, one of the boys would ask why. And I made it a point, if I didn't know the answer already, I would go and get one of my books, and I would look it up, because that's why I've kept every book I've ever gotten with anything to do with Judaica, so I could take it off the shelf and look. I've had questions, and even when they couldn't answer it, we'd go together and we'd look it up. When I did the Jewish book fair at the day high before Rambam, when we did the Jewish book fair, I bought a lot of books for the sake of making a Jewish library so that we could ask and answer questions. Because I don't believe in doing something just by rote and not knowing the whys, because that's how I grew up, and I didn't like that. I was lucky to light the Shabbos candles at my house, and that was it. As soon as I finished my meal, so let's eat. And I'll never forget one Passover. I did the candles, I did the blessing over I did the kiddush, and I did the blessing over the matzah and the motzi and everything. And my father just piped up and said, "Why are you doing the kiddush?" And my older brother pipes up, "Because if she didn't do it, nobody else would, and you know that." And I'm like, whoa. And so he shut his mouth and started eating.
Morris, let me ask you a little bit about your background, and then I'll come back to the two of you and some of the questions about Mikveh Israel and confirmation. Would you tell me your full name and tell me a little bit about how your family got to this area?
Okay. Again, my name is Morris Friedman.
No middle name.
Grew up in Brunswick. You interviewed my sister, I believe. And there's a story I might add to what she told you that might give some insight into life in a small town for Jews. But both sides of my family, maternal and paternal, are both Ashkenazi, both hailing from Russia, Eastern Europe. Grandparents came here turn of the century and just after 1900. My mother's father sometime around 1910. And my grandmother, my father's mother, came over and went through Ellis Island in 1899. And they originally settled in New York. And my father came from a large family, 6 siblings, 5 boys, 1 girl. The last one, my aunt, just recently passed away about a month and a half ago. She was 94. But they moved from New York to, of all places, Reidsville, Georgia. Because they had friends in that area. A lot of the Jews settled in the small little towns, and as you said, they opened the shmata stores.
Yeah,
That's how they earned their living. Or they took other commodities and went on the road. And my father's family did both. My mother's family stayed in New York. My mother was born and raised in Brooklyn until my father married her in 1946 and schlepped her south. Now, as far as backgrounds, my mother's side, I can only go back to my grandparents, and that's it. They were not big into, well, we go this, and this one came from so-and-so. And when Linda started really getting serious about genealogy, and she can trace back to 1492.
Not quite.
Facetious, but I got jealous. Now, my grandmother, as I found out, you know, as Jews, we grew up hearing about the Our Crowd family societies from New York. Turns out I'm connected to one, the Schifrin Society, which my father had always talked about, but I never knew much about it. So when she started getting into hers, I finally decided, well, I'll look into this. Well, it's big. There are members all over the country. They have a reunion every 2 years. The family tree is published on the website. DNA is registered, believe it or not. And I have our family tree, which I can trace back. Our family can be traced back to 1790 in a little shtetl called Zembin in Belarus. And it's just outside Kiev.
So this is very interesting because my family had a cousins club. They were all gone, and there was no one left to tell the stories. But there was a cousins club, and they used to they set up a family circle. Now we have here in Savannah a workman's family circle, and we have social services that are done as part of the Jewish community, whether it's Federation or before that the Joint Distribution Committee, or whether it's Chevra Kadisha or the Women's Benevolent Aid Society. What is it about? Is this just a family thing that families take care of their own, or is there something in Jewish tradition that makes it us want to care and be caregivers for members of our family?
Well, it's
Well,
one.
no, let me answer this. Yeah. The Ashkenazis in particular, to them family was everything. You know, you could always trust your family, mostly, but you
That's an
never,
inside joke.
you could never trust outsiders. And it was always important to know the mishpacha and to keep in touch. And I think that's why these societies were founded, because once they came over here, they all scattered to the four winds. This was the way of keeping everybody connected, so you could find a way, you know, to find out what cousin Yankel is doing in L.A., or, you know, cousin Schmokey is in Philadelphia, whatever. And that's why these societies were formed.
Well, I think part of it too is because so much was lost during the Holocaust, that what little bit was left, what remnants were left, were put together so that what was left shouldn't be lost. You know, I think that's part of it too. And as far as the part about caring about family and taking care of family, that's one of the mitzvot, and that has been drummed into people's heads. You know, particularly Jewish people's heads, that, you know, that's one of the mitzvot. You take care of your family. Some societies, some cultures dump them by the wayside or shuffle them off to Buffalo or what have you. But we, you know, Judaism, we've never done that. It's one of the mitzvot that we take care of our family. You know, whatever it takes, we do. And some people try to take advantage of it, you know, that are not Jewish and they're looking for, you know, panhandling kind of thing. But basically, you know, I think that's a large part of it too.
You know what? The Schifrin Family Association dates from 1912. There were happening people in 1912. That's the beginning of Hadassah. It's the beginning of Girl Scouts, not Jewish, but
Yeah.
there were certainly Jewish Girl Scouts in 1912. And it was the beginning of the JEA. And the JEA was also set up as an alliance of Jewish organizations, and in some ways to educate our own. But there was, even if the Mikveh Israel members did not always feel welcome, the truth is members of Mikveh Israel actually were the founders, part and parcel of the JEA. And the JEA gained so much of its strength because it was the Jewish organization. So I'm going to ask you specifically, Linda, because you really grew up here, but you can answer this as well from your observation. The JEA was a haven for Jews as a community center because, as I'm talking to people, there were very few other clubs or associations that they could belong to
That's very
unless
true.
they were Jewish. And that over the years, maybe because we're so accepted in society, you know, the purpose of the JEA, or the original purpose, is no longer as important. And you find a lot of people that are totally unaffiliated, and especially unaffiliated with even the community center. You would think people who might not be ritualistic and might not want to join a synagogue would at least join the institutions. So it was just kind of a general discussion out there, but react, I think, to the idea of the purpose of Jewish institutions, and has being an American somehow supplanted the need for this type of organization?
Well, as I said, when I made the comment that Israel is cyclical in nature, the Jewish community is cyclical in nature. And I have seen that in my lifetime, because the point that you made was a very good point, that when I was a child, there were a number of organizations that we were persona non grata in. And there were not very many social organizations to which we could belong. And in fact, the Harmony, that's one reason the Harmony Club originated. When my parents, when I was a child, my parents were members of the Harmony Club because it was a Jewish social club, because we couldn't go anywhere else. You couldn't go to the Oglethorpe clubs, you couldn't go to the yacht club, God forbid you should set foot in those places. So we had the Harmony Club. And then once there was more acclamation and more acceptance, and we were welcomed into other places, the Harmony Club actually withered a little bit. Now, we were members of the Harmony Club way back when. I think it's disbanded completely.
It disbanded about 10 years ago.
Yeah, but anyway, so that's the cyclical nature of it. They tried to bring it back a little bit for the younger generation, but there's so many other places we now can go to that there was not the interest to sustain it. It was okay for a little while, but there was not the interest to sustain it. And I think that's the acclamation and the fact that more doors opened up for us changed a lot of things over the years. Before, we had to keep to ourselves of necessity because we weren't welcomed anywhere else. Now we can go virtually, and particularly with the laws changing, anti-discrimination laws changing, we can go virtually anywhere we want to go, except these very private organizations that are exempt from those laws. But with those exceptions, anybody else has to open their doors to us. And I think another change, too, with the JEA, up until, I don't know the year, but up until, I don't know, I want to say maybe, I'm guessing 20 years ago, it was primarily for Jewish people. If you look at the membership of the JEA now, guess what? We're probably in the minority. I hate to tell you, number-wise, because of with United Way and all of that, the gym and the athletic facilities were head and shoulders above most other facilities in the city. People were joining for that. We have at least 50% non-Jewish membership.
I was on the board a number of years ago. It was just after it had been renovated. And that was when they were just opening it up to non-Jews. The primary reason was money.
Right, well, there's another
Very
reason,
simple.
too. There's another reason, too. I don't know at what point the JEA became affiliated or a part of United Way, but once it did, we had to operate under United Way's rules. And that meant we had to open our doors.
And that was for money also. They wanted to allow these kids in under the umbrella of the United Way because they would get grants from the United Way.
Right, yeah. I mean, I guess it all does go back to money any way you slice it, one way or another, to a certain extent. But there were a number of different factors that popped up in recent years that were not there before that has completely changed the outlook and the setup of everything.
But if all it were a very small percentage of the population, but if all the Jews in Savannah actually joined the Jewish institutions, there wouldn't necessarily be a need to attract members of the non-Jewish population to help keep the doors open. Is there a purpose in having Jewish clubs like that
there's
anymore?
one thing
then?
that you mentioned a minute ago. There is an organization, I out at the landings called Jewish Women
Jewish
at the
women in the
Landings.
landings.
Yeah, Jewish. They're purely social. No religious. They don't want to have any religious connection. They're purely social. Now there's some that are members of both that and other, religious organizations, but they're purely social and nothing more. There's some people that don't care a bit about being Jewish. They're not going to go out and become Christian, but they're not observant. They're not affiliated, and all they want is the social aspect of it. And those people, are going to gravitate towards that aspect of it. So you got the spectrum from one end to the other, from the Orthodox to the totally non-affiliated, non-observant, non-anything, and everything in between.
So Morris, you belong to a very different social club, the U.S. military. Do you want to tell me a little bit about what it's like being a Jew
Ooh, some
in
interesting
military
stories.
service? Especially since, if I remember correctly, you have overseas military experience.
Oh yes.
Quite a bit. It was interesting, to say the least. I went in September of 1969, right after high school. We had a little thing called the draft going on, and Vietnam. So I knew I wasn't going to get a student deferment, not with the grades that I was making at the time. So I figured I'd enlist on my terms and try to avoid Vietnam.
Yeah.
Well, I enlisted, went through training. 6 months later, I was on a plane heading guess where. But during basic training at Fort Benning in Columbus, they did make allowances for religious services for the Jewish soldiers, which really surprised me. I never expected that. But, every post I went to, from Fort Benning to Fort Lee in Virginia, which is right 40 miles outside of Richmond, they always had rabbis there, because back then, the draft affected them as well. And, when a rabbi got ordained, it was gently suggested that he do his time in the military if he wanted a good congregation. So, we did have rabbis. And oddly enough, when I was in Vietnam, they had the rabbis there as well, and I got together several times with them. We had one time a Passover. Wasn't an actual Seder, but we got together. We had some foods that, oddly enough, there was a cold storage warehouse where I was stationed in Cameron Bay that was chock full of kosher items. But nobody could get it. Not even the rabbis.
Oh geez.
Ridiculous, stupid red tape. But that was finally corrected. But
So I was going to ask you the question, Linda.
What?
Is that growing up in a small southern town, did you find it difficult? And I realized that that Reform Jews didn't necessarily keep kosher, but did you find keeping certain rituals difficult? But I guess you would have had the same difficulties in the Army,
Right.
and so both of you speak from a very different experience, but it's the same experience.
Well, I mean, when I grew up, we actually had a kosher butcher here, the Goldsmans. Mr. Goldsman. Can't think of his. Kaminsky. Fran Kaminsky's father was Joseph Goldsman, the kosher butcher. And I vividly remember going there many times with my Orthodox grandmother to do shopping. And so at that time, you could get kosher meats. And Gottlieb's was, the deli and the bakery, so you could get that stuff when you needed it. And the grocery stores had some kosher items. And so it wasn't as difficult to keep kosher and be observant if you wanted to be. It was a matter of making the effort. It was not cheap, and not everybody could afford to do it. Of course, my family coming up to perform, could care less about it. But it was there if you wanted to do it. It was available if you wanted to do it. When Mr. Goldsman closed the butcher shop, that was the worst thing that ever happened to the Jewish community in Savannah. After that, if you really wanted kosher meat, you had to send to Atlanta for it, one way or another. And over the years, that's evolved into different things as well. And then the supermarkets have since expanded what they've got. So it's very different now from the way it was when I was a child. But getting back to his military, we did have experiences where there was some overt anti-Semitism as well in the military.
And I would assume in the South as well. Would you talk to that experience, please?
Okay, well, the experiences that I've had with anti-Semitism have been married to him and being in the military. When we were first married in Germany, there was the Army always sent down a directive from headquarters, not just the Army, Department of Defense, for all the services, for the high holidays. All Jewish personnel were to be released in time to get to high holiday services, barring an honest-to-Pete emergency. There was one general, a one-star general, in the area where we were, that decided to be, politely put, horse's rear end, and called a restricted alert on Yom Kippur. From sundown, right when Call Nidri would be, to sundown, the end of Yom Kippur. And found out about it like 4 o'clock in the afternoon. He called me on the phone because I had a job and I was working on different posts than he was. And he said, we got a problem. He said, I can't come get you because I can't leave, and we can't go to services, we can't do squat. I said, how am I supposed to get home? He said, you have to find a friend or somebody to give you a ride home. So I was lucky enough to find somebody in my office to give me a ride home. Didn't come to work the next day because I wasn't going to come on Yom Kippur regardless. I just had my prayer books and I read my prayers at home. But we couldn't do squat. And he did that deliberately because he was anti-Semitic. And there was another guy that during that same time period that held him back from promotion for a full year because he was a German in the United States Army, and because he was Jewish, he had to sign off on his going before the promotion board, and he refused to do it for a full year. Had to wait till we got back here to Savannah. And right after we got back to Savannah, when he was stationed at Hunter the first time, he was promoted. So that cost him a year's time in grade, which translated probably cost him money out of his retirement pay. He would have had a higher retirement pay had that year not been taken from him. So, it trickled down effect. It affected us. And, there were a few other instances. But the only time I experienced anti-Semitism here in the South was when Paul was a baby. I worked as a secretary, and I guess it's better if I don't name the place, but anyway, I worked as a secretary for in an office, and coincidentally, Fran Kaminsky worked in the same office at the same time, and they knew she was Jewish, and with my name being Friedman, any dummy would know that I was Jewish. But I guess as long as you didn't discuss the fact, it was allowed. Well, one day Fran happened to come in and walk past my desk, and I said, "Are you planning to go to the meeting tonight?" And I was referring to an ORT meeting because ORT was still active at that time. I didn't even say what organization. I simply said, "Are you planning to go to the meeting tonight?" She said, "No," and shot back to the back. Next thing I know, 30 minutes later, I was fired and out the door. Because this guy, my boss, the head of this organization, was so anti-Semitic. He tolerated Fran because he needed Fran and he needed her expertise. He didn't need me that bad. And he was that anti-Semitic. Like I said, as long as you kept your mouth shut and didn't discuss it, you'd be tolerated. But the minute, and he just assumed, I guess, Jewish meeting, because we were two Jewish people talking about it. And her reaction to where, she bolted, and, 30 minutes later, I was out the door. But the thing is, even today, you have to be able to prove it to do anything about it, and there was no way to prove it. Because there's every excuse in the book.
If I can go backward just a bit,
Mhm.
to tell you a wonderful, wonderful story about how Jews can get things done in the military. Jeremy was born when we were stationed in Hawaii. And this story concerns his breasts. And it was so wonderful. And I'm going to let Linda tell it.
Okay. Well, I don't know if you remember, if you were here at the time when Rabbi Eisenstark was at the B.B. Jacob. He was the Moyle. And when Eunice's son, Joshua was born, he did Joshua's bris. And we were in Germany, stationed at the time, and we came home for the bris. And when he found out that Morris was in the military, he said, I want to tell you something. He said, when you get ready to have your babies, if you have a boy and you need a mohel, the Army pays for the mohel, because they paid for me I don't know how many times to go to different military posts to do a bris. So don't let them give you a snow job. Okay, fast forward, Paul was born here in Savannah, so it was no problem. Fast forward to when Jeremy was born in Hawaii. And, you know.
We had an Orthodox rabbi who was Navy, served all the military in
He's at
Hawaii.
Pearl Harbor. Anyway, he didn't know that the military paid for him well. He'd had a baby boy the year before. And when he found out that he could have gotten a boy, he was fit to be tied. But anyway, after the baby was born, and I started trying to make arrangements for a bris, he said, well, you're just going to have to use a Jewish doctor, Jewish physician from Tripler Army Medical Center, and I'll do the religious part. I said, no, I don't. He says, what do you mean? I said, I've got it from a mohel that the Army pays for a mohel. He said, they don't pay for a mohel. I said, yes, they do. Watch me. I got on the phone, went all the way up the chain of command, headquarters DA, and through, you know, all the different command levels. Long story short, they approved it. Orders came back down for a mohel to be sent from the Presidio in California to Honolulu. Morris is at work one day, gets a phone call, and his lieutenant answers the phone, and it's the three-star general who was the commander of West Coast who had to sign off on the orders. He says, this is General so-and-so. I need to speak to Sergeant Friedman. Well, the lieutenant drains color, and he says, one moment, sir, and he puts him on hold. He says, Friedman, the general's on the phone. What the hell did you do? You know, and Morris goes, I don't know. But he gets on the phone, he says, Sergeant Friedman, this is General so-and-so. He said, I got a set of orders in front of me, and I'll sign them, but I'd like to know what the heck I'm signing. What the hell is a bris? Because that's what they put on the orders. They didn't put circumcision.
Yeah.
So,
Yeah. Bottom line, the Army paid $3,500 for Jeremy's bris to import, you know, this full colonel.
Orthodox, no less.
Yeah, he was a teacher of all things Arabic studies at the Presidio in San Francisco, at the Defense Language Institute, and they put him on a plane. Had to put him up in a hotel for 3 days.
Kosher cuisine.
That's right.
Kosher cuisine.
It was wonderful.
That is quite amazing.
Yeah.
We are running short of time. Let me get back to the original purpose of this, and that is about the fact that the Jews did very well in Savannah, partially because Oglethorpe, who didn't particularly care for Jews, allowed us to stay, and partially because who we are as Jews, and our rituals, our traditions, our emphasis on education and mitzvot. So I want you to think, and both of you can answer this question, I want you to think about what it is that you know about Judaism that you think has aided you in being good Savannahans. Or, conversely, what is it about being Jewish that you think has really been a boost to this community?
Well, you know, talking about Oglethorpe for a second, one of the reasons that we were tolerated and allowed to stay too was the fact that we had certain professions and things that others did not. If I remember correctly, the first doctor in the colony was a Jew, and they needed a doctor. You know, so mother of necessity. But anyway, I don't know. That's kind of a broad-based question. You know, I think part of it is the fact that we have always raised our children, obviously with the tenets of Judaism and the mitzvot, but also to be the kind of human beings that we would be proud of, regardless of religion, but the kind of human beings that we could be proud of. And, you know, I'll toot my own horn and his horn to say that I think we succeeded admirably, because there have been instances that have happened in their lives where they have shown their true colors in being Jews and being good, decent, moral human beings, where other kids would have had monumental issues. And we have been blessed that we have not had to deal with a lot of the problems that a lot of today's parents, and even the previous generation's parents, had to deal with. And, you know, when it came down to brass tacks, they knew where they stood. They knew what they were made out of. And they did us proud. And so, like I keep telling him, I said, if I didn't do anything else right, at least I did something right, and that's the two of them, you know. So,
Morris?
There's really nothing I can add to that.
You know, we like to think of ourselves as good, decent, moral human beings, but it really hits home when you see it in your children, when you know that what you've planted, the seed that you've planted, has taken root 1,000-fold.
So if you condense Judaism down to its basic essence, what is the lesson that you hope that your children and now your grandchildren have learned about Judaism from you?
I think basically what I just said about the to be a good, decent, moral human beings. Because I remember an instance a few years back. We got together with them. We met up in Athens for one of the Georgia football games, and they were driving over from Greenville, and they ran late because my daughter-in-law Dana had to work that morning, and they were waiting for her to get off. And I don't remember exactly all the details, but there was this one guy that was really holding up the works and creating a lot of problems. And Paul made a crack on the phone to me with Riley sitting in the car, and she was maybe, I don't know, 3 or 4 years old, about 4 years old, I guess. About he liked to let the air out of his tires or go smash his windshield or something like that. And she, in the background, she says, "Daddy, that's not nice. You don't do that." You know, so it had already taken root. He said, "You're absolutely right. I shouldn't have said that. I'm sorry." You know, he just popped off without thinking, but she knew enough to know that wasn't the right thing to do.
Well,
So,
there was also something else Paul once told me. And, yeah, this is when he had gone off to Georgia, and he would say, you know, sometimes I felt like doing this and such or something else, or just not doing something. And he said, inside me there was a 5,000-year-old voice saying, "Remember."
yeah, he's told me that too. He told me that too. And when he would consider certain things, he said he has this 5,000-year-old voice in his head that reminds him from time to time. That was his way of phrasing it. So, like I say, the biggest pleasure, the single biggest pleasure we get is to know that the seed that we planted has flourished. Both.
That's fantastic. I think that's a good place to end. The only thing that I really do you have any quick memories of being confirmed, what you learned, whether you enjoyed it, whether
Oh, yes.
anyone got bat mitzvahed, what did it teach you for?
That's the
for
cyclical
life?
nature. Again, my father was bar mitzvahed. When we came up, they didn't have bar and bat mitzvahs, and now they've gone full circle again. They're going back to it. So McFisher was like a wheel that rolls and rolls and rolls, you know, and goes from one thing to the other. But as far as confirmation is concerned, yes, I do, because I was in the class that was confirmed by Rabbi Buchler. And if you remember, we only had him for 2 years because he died very young, too young. And the first class that he confirmed, Rabbi Starrell started. Rabbi Starrell's retired in December because that was when his birthday was, and Rabbi Buchler finished that class. The class after mine, he started that class, and then he died in January, so Rabbi Starrell's came back and finished that class. So that was each half and half. My class was the only one that he did start to finish. To me, that's something very special. And in addition to the typical confirmation textbook learning, he also taught us a class in comparative religions, and he took us around to different churches in Savannah, which was the smartest thing he could do, because we needed to learn that you know the expression, no man is an island. We had to learn we lived in a larger environment, and these were our neighbors and what they were all about, and they were good, decent people too. And I remember we went to the cathedral, the Greek Orthodox Church, the Episcopal Church, Methodist Church, Ardsley Park Baptist Church, and I thoroughly enjoyed it. My funniest memory of it was when we went to the Greek Orthodox. They had the thing with the incense that they shake, you know. Well, we were honored guests. We were sat in the front row. They shook the thing right in front of me, and until that day, I didn't know I was allergic to incense. I gagged and choked and couldn't breathe. He grabbed my arm to get me out of there, and he told the 3 boys, because it was me and the 3 boys, he said, "You sit still, you be quiet, you behave yourself, and you make sure you don't cause any problems." And then he got me out of there. You know, it was unspoken on pain of death, you know. And he had to sit outside with me because I couldn't breathe. But, you know, it wasn't funny then, but it's funny in retrospect.
Is there a sense of continuity you get, or a sense of pride you get because your name is on that confirmation chain?
Oh, absolutely. Absolutely. I mean, it's a link in a chain, not just literally, but figuratively. A chain that goes way back, even I think probably beyond what we even know, because there's so much that wasn't recorded or has been lost over time. And, you know, even with my own family knowing that it goes back in generations, yes, it's very definitely. And one other thing, on that confirmation chain, I have two older brothers. The older one was the older of the two was in a very small class. The middle one was the actual baby boom generation, because it was the group that was born right after World War II. That was the largest class in confirmation history. I think it was like 25 kids. They couldn't fit all those names on one side of the link. Every other one was on one side of the link. Half of them were on the other side of the link, and everybody forgets that. And when they go to look at those links and list names off of it, they forget the other half. And I have to keep reminding people, there are other people on the other side of that link.
Actually, we've made the correction to the book because
I told
of you.
Herbert about that, yes.
Thank you both very, very much.
Could I
Yes,
just
uh-huh.
interject one
Sure.
small story? Kind of an addendum to what my sister would have told you about how, and it also has to do with a bar mitzvah, how a Jewish woman got creative and adaptive, you know, in a small town with no Jewish facilities. You know, it was my bar mitzvah, and about a week prior, we came up to Savannah, to Gottlieb's on 32nd Street, to pick up the cake and the sweets and the rye bread and so forth. Well, the party was going to be around 7 o'clock that night after the bar mitzvah, and my mother wanted something to eat. So she wanted to get some kosher corned beef, you know, to spread out. And they could make sandwiches with the rye bread and so forth. Well, she asked, I don't know, it wasn't Issa, but it was one of the other older.
Elliot Irving.
I think, yeah, it was Irving. Said, how much is your kosher corned beef sliced? And he told her the price. Well, whatever it was, they couldn't afford it for that much. So my mama thought for a minute, and she says, I'll tell you, just add 2 boxes of kosher salt to my order. We went home, she said, I'm gonna make it myself. Now, she learned to cook, you know, she brought up in an Orthodox home. Her mama taught her to cook kosher and keep kosher. She went to the local butcher in town, got a 15-pound corned beef brisket, which, you know, was not a popular cut in 1964. You know, the only ones who knew what a brisket was were the Irish for their corned beef, the Jews, and people in Texas because they barbecued it. So she brought it home. She cured it with the kosher salt, drained all the blood out. I mean, went through every step just the way her mom had taught her. Cook it, put the right spices in, and then, you know, had it sliced, and it was delicious. But that's how, you know, you had to get creative in a small southern town.
That's a perfect story on which to end. Thank you both very much.
Our pleasure.